In this lesson, we will explore watercolor brushes in more detail. Of the three watercolor types in Painter, Real Watercolor looks and feels the most realistic, so that's what we're going to be focusing on. Just like its traditional counterpart, digital watercolor painting requires a lot of skill and patience. Don't feel discouraged if you find this medium challenging to work with. You are not alone. The Real Watercolor brush category covers a range of watercolor looks, but I also have some of my own custom watercolor brushes. I'll load the Watercolor Crow template. This has several layers for paper texture, ink, and watercolor. The paper texture overlay will cover the paint with texture to make the pigment look like it's absorbing into the paper. If the texture is too strong for you, you can always reduce the opacity of the layer. This effect works best if your brush is using the same texture as the overlay, so I'll select the cold-pressed watercolor paper. If I paint a test stroke with light blue using the Speckle Tiger Lily brush, and then show and hide the texture, you can see how much the texture enhances the look of the paint. The ink is on a separate layer, so that we can color beneath it on the blank watercolor layer. And then at the bottom is a tone layer that turns the canvas an off-white so that you can see the paper texture. This combination of layers gives you the look of watercolor paper. Without these layers, it will be difficult to faithfully emulate a traditional watercolor painting. While I prefer the aesthetic of starting with a template, you do not have to use watercolors in this way. If you're going to attempt to make something that looks like a traditional watercolor, you'll need to study what a traditional watercolor painting looks like, as well as the tools, techniques, and processes used. I won't be able to cover all of that in this particular lesson, but I'll do my best to summarize some of the key concepts as we go along. Traditional watercolor paintings are made by diluting pigment in water. When working with digital watercolors, the value of the paint controls the concentration of pigment, with white representing clean water. The lighter the color, the less concentrated the pigment will appear. Paint that is less concentrated takes many more layers of paint to build up to full opacity and saturation. If the color builds up too quickly, it may ruin the illusion of traditional watercolor. There are other properties that can affect the concentration of watercolor pigment, but we will come back to those later. I'll select my light fringe jitter AR brush, and I'll fill in the crow with a light blue. It's okay to be sloppy since this is a demonstration, but if this were a serious painting, I'd be more careful about keeping my paint inside the lines. Now I'll select a light brown color and fill in the branch. Because white functions as clean water instead of opaque paint, you will want to reserve any areas you want to be white in your painting. You'd use the same technique for a traditional watercolor. Since you are working digitally, you can use your eraser to remove paint, but that does not look very natural. Even a wet eraser looks odd, so it's best to just avoid white areas or protect them with a selection. If you want an opaque white paint that diffuses, you can create a new default layer and paint with a real wet oils brush. I'll use liquid oil for example. This paint diffuses like watercolor and covers the layers beneath. You can modify the diffusion process using the Real Wet Oils and Real Wet Watercolor flyouts, or panels. The Real Watercolor panel gives you full control over the pigment, water, paper, flow, and other properties. Many of these properties can be modified throughout the diffusion process, which makes Real Watercolor one of the most interactive palettes in Painter. We'll explore these properties throughout this section. The look and behavior of the watercolor brushes can also be affected by the various wet subcategories. If you want a detailed explanation of each of these subcategories, you can watch the lesson about subcategories. I'll load the watercolor template, and I'll demonstrate with a few of the different subcategories. As you can see, I can create paint that covers, paint that builds up, and dry paint that does not immediately diffuse, but can be made wet at a later point. Because the diffusion process is dynamic, you can pause or stop the diffusion at any time, which will freeze the state of the paint. I'll unpause it. If I make a very large brush and paint with aqua over the entire composition, the more paint you add at once, the longer the diffusion process will take. This is literally like watching paint dry, but it lets you see what the diffusion looks like. The paint is trickling and flowing into the paper. While it's doing that, your computer is processing all of that information, and that takes time. It will also create a processing bottleneck for any additional brush strokes, so you'll need to wait for the diffusion to complete before doing any more painting. If it feels painfully slow to work this way, you can use the Pause Diffusion button in the Properties bar to keep diffusion from happening until you are ready for it. I'll add multiple colors of paint and then let it diffuse. If diffusion is taking forever and you just want it to stop, you can undo to remove that stroke, or you can clear the layer. You can also dry the watercolor layer to permanently stop the diffusion process before the pigment completely settles or the water flows beyond a certain point. In traditional art, this is known as a hairdryer. Even quicker than clicking in the Properties bar would be to create a custom keyboard shortcut for dry watercolor layer. Even with the diffusion stopped, as long as the paint is still editable as a watercolor layer, it's never truly dry, and you can continue to paint on it and diffuse it with water. We can also control the concentration of the paint from the Properties bar, which determines the amount of pigment the brush deposits on the paper. We'll come back to this in the next lesson. As I mentioned at the beginning of this lesson, the watercolor brushes can utilize grain. The grain influences the diffusion pattern, allowing the pigment to settle into the texture of the paper. I'm using cold-pressed watercolor, which I have also applied as a surface texture overlay on a separate layer. I can make a few strokes with varying levels of grain, and when I hide the paper texture layer, you can see how the grain affects the diffusion. The stroke looks more lumpy when grain is higher. You can use multiple layers of watercolor in your composition. I'll create another watercolor layer above my first watercolor layer and rearrange it. This makes working with watercolor a little less risky because you can separate elements and then fuse them together later if you like. Starting in Painter 2021, you can merge multiple watercolor layers together without converting them to default layers. You can also flip watercolor layers horizontally and vertically. Because you are working digitally, you can even combine watercolor with other brush types, including blenders. One of the best blenders for working with watercolor is Just Add Water. Because only watercolor brushes can be used on watercolor layers, I'll need to convert this to a default layer. Now I can blend while maintaining a wet appearance. However, because this is a default layer, it will no longer interact with watercolor brushes. That is, unless I right-click and convert this default layer back to a watercolor layer. Now the paint is wet again and editable with watercolor brushes. If I paint into it with a different color, the paint will diffuse together. In the lesson about selection brushes, we looked at some techniques that can be used to trap watercolor within a specific area or keep it out of an area using a selection. You could use the selection tools, the selection brushes, or even auto-generate a selection. As you can see, I can use the splatter selection brush to trap my paint inside of a splatter shape. Now let's discuss some tips for improving your watercolor painting performance. I'll reset the template and brush. If we look near the bottom of the Real Watercolor panel, there is a property for Animation Step. This can smooth out the visual appearance of diffusion. Animation Step is set at 3 right now, so if I use a smaller brush to paint a stroke, you can see that the paint is trickling and diffusing in near real time. It feels fairly smooth. If I compare that with the animation step at 10, you can see the diffusion becomes more choppy because there are fewer steps of animation. Lower animation steps look smoother, but they also cause the paint to diffuse more slowly. That could potentially be a good thing if you find the watercolor diffuses too fast and you don't have enough time to dry it or modify the properties. Higher animation steps allow the diffusion to complete more quickly, so when speed is a concern, max that out. The choppy animations bother my eye, so I prefer the aesthetic of a smoother diffusion for most brushes. But if I'm using large brushes, then it makes sense to use a higher animation step. You can adjust the stepping at any point in the diffusion process. Above the animation steps, there is a property for accurate diffusion. This will apply diffusion precisely to ensure accurate water flow. It's not until you try to make watercolor flow that you'll see the difference accurate diffusion makes. I'll select my watercolor drip brush, select the horizontal flow map, which is rotated 90 degrees. and paint a large, dense blob with a large brush. When accurate diffusion is disabled, the diffusion is less complex, so the flow can last longer. You can see the paint dripping down the canvas. I'll paint with accurate diffusion enabled, and you can see that the diffusion happens more slowly because it is processing a more complex simulation. This causes the paint to diffuse radially more than in a single direction, so the result is paint that does not flow as far, but it often has a stronger fringe along the edges and a more realistic looking appearance overall. I'll disable accurate diffusion. Another property you can take advantage of is delayed diffusion. My watercolor drip brush has this enabled, so if I paint a stroke, the paint does not start diffusing until I complete the stroke and lift my pen up. You might find that this makes watercolor easier to control. If I make a stroke without delaying the diffusion, you can see that the paint starts diffusing immediately, which looks and feels more natural. That was an overview of what Real Watercolor can do. Next, we'll go through the Real Watercolor panel and take a look at each property individually. You can watch the second half of this lesson along with the rest of this course by purchasing it from my website at aaronrutten.com.